Imagine standing on your knees, cold stone beneath you, stripped of your dignity, facing the most terrifying tribunal on earth. The year is 1633. The place is Rome. You are an old man, broken in body but sharp in mind, and before you sit the grand inquisitors of the Catholic Church. They demand that you curse your own life's work. They demand that you look up at the heavens and lie. They demand that you declare the earth stands perfectly still, a stagnant center of a rigid universe. If you refuse, the torture chambers await, followed by a burning stake. This was a terrifying reality for a man who looked into the night sky and dared to see the truth. A man who looked at the stars and realized that everything humanity had believed for thousands of years was a lie. This is the story of Galileo Galilei, the man who defied the absolute power of the Church, shattered the ancient cosmos, and single-handedly birthed the modern world. To understand the magnitude of Galileo's defiance, we must first understand the world he was born into. In the late 16th century, the universe was considered a settled matter. For over 1,000 years, humanity lived under the absolute certainty of the geocentric model, championed by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle and the astronomer Ptolemy, and fiercely guarded by the Christian Church. In this universe, the Earth was the stationary, unmoving center of creation. Around it, the sun, the moon, and the planets revolved in perfect, unblemished, divine circles. This wasn't just a scientific theory. It was a fundamental theological truth. The Bible seemed to confirm it. Man was God's ultimate creation, so naturally man's home had to be at the exact center of everything. To question this order was not just an intellectual disagreement, it was a direct attack on the structure of reality, a challenge to the Word of God, and an act of cosmic treason. But Galileo Galilei was not a man built for compliance. Born in Pisa in 1564, he possessed a mind that was relentlessly curious, deeply skeptical, and utterly unbothered by tradition. Where others saw established truth, Galileo saw questions waiting to be answered. As a young professor, he had already gained a reputation for challenging authority, proving that heavy objects of different masses fall at the same speed, directly contradicting Aristotle. But it was in the autumn of 1609 that his destiny would alter the course of human history forever. Word reached Venice of a strange new invention from Flanders, a Dutch spyglass, a simple toy made of two lenses in a tube that made distant objects appear closer. While others saw it as a military tool or a mere curiosity, Galileo saw something far grander. Without ever seeing the Dutch design, he relied on his sheer genius to grind his own lenses, improving the device's magnification by a factor of 30. He did not point his new instrument at enemy ships or distant horizons. Instead, on a clear winter night in Padua, Galileo raised his telescope to the heavens. What he saw through that crude tube of wood and glass shattered the ancient world in an instant. For millennia, humanity believed the moon was a perfect, smooth, unblemished celestial sphere of pure light. But as Galileo adjusted his focus, the shadows elongated, revealing a jagged landscape. The moon was not perfect. It was rough, scarred, covered in deep craters and towering mountain ranges. It was a world just like Earth. Days later, he turned his telescope toward Jupiter, the largest planet in the night sky. Near its bright disk, he noticed 3 tiny, star-like points of light, perfectly aligned. Intrigued, he watched them night after night. To his absolute astonishment, these tiny stars moved, changing their positions but always remaining tethered to Jupiter. Galileo realized he was witnessing something that, according to ancient science, was completely impossible: bodies that did not orbit the Earth. Jupiter had its own moons. The Earth was not the unique center of all cosmic motion. When he looked at Venus, he saw it go through distinct phases, waxing and waning just like our moon. This was the final, undeniable proof. Venus could only display these phases if it was orbiting the Sun, not the Earth. The ancient, comforting illusion of a stationary Earth was falling apart. Galileo had caught a glimpse of the true universe, a vast, dynamic system where the Earth was just one of many worlds spinning through the dark void, orbiting a massive central sun. This was the heliocentric model, first proposed decades earlier by Nicolaus Copernicus, but now, for the very first time, it was backed by empirical, visual proof. Eager to share this revolutionary truth, Galileo published his findings in 1610 in a short book titled The Starry Messenger. It was an overnight sensation. Copies flew across Europe, and Galileo became the most famous scientist of his age. But as his fame grew, so did the shadows of envy and fear. The academic elite, whose entire careers were built on Aristotelian philosophy, felt threatened. More dangerously, conservative theologians realized that if Galileo was right, the traditional interpretation of Scripture was wrong. If the Earth moved, then humanity was no longer the physical center of God's universe. The machinery of the Holy Inquisition began to turn. In 1616, Galileo was summoned to Rome. The Church officially declared the Copernican theory to be foolish, absurd, and formally heretical. Galileo was personally warned by Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, the Church's chief theologian, that he must completely abandon the idea that the Earth moves. He was forbidden to hold, teach, or defend the sun-centered universe in any way. For a man who lived for the truth, this was a devastating spiritual and intellectual gag order. Galileo retreated to his villa near Florence, silenced but far from defeated. For over a decade, he watched the skies in secret, waiting for the political tides to shift. That shift seemed to arrive in 1623 with the election of a new pope, Urban VIII. The new pope was Maffeo Barberini, a highly educated, forward-thinking patron of the arts and sciences who had long admired Galileo's intellect. Galileo traveled to Rome and secured multiple audiences with his old friend. The Pope gave Galileo permission to write a new book, provided he treat the Copernican theory only as a hypothetical mathematical tool and not as absolute truth. Galileo felt vindicated. He believed he finally had the freedom to present his evidence to the world. For several years, Galileo poured his soul into his masterpiece, the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Written not in academic Latin but in common Italian so that ordinary people could read it, the book was structured as a witty, dramatic debate, spanning 4 days between 3 characters. There was Salviati, a brilliant astronomer who spoke for Galileo and defended the sun-centered universe. There was Sagredo, an open-minded, neutral observer. And finally, there was Simplicio, a dogmatic, slow-witted philosopher who defended the old Earth-centered view using Aristotelian arguments. The book was a literary and scientific triumph, but it was also a fatal miscalculation. Galileo's enemies immediately pounced, convincing the Pope that the book was a direct insult to his authority. To make matters worse, Galileo had placed some of the Pope's own arguments about the universe into the mouth of Simplicio, whose very name implied a simpleton. Pope Urban VIII, already under intense political pressure from the Protestant Reformation and the 30 Years' War, felt deeply betrayed. His admiration turned to blinding fury. The book was immediately banned, and the elderly, ailing Galileo was ordered to stand trial before the Inquisition on suspicion of heresy. In the spring of 1633, a 69-year-old Galileo, suffering from severe arthritis and failing eyesight, arrived in Rome. The trial was a psychological nightmare. Stripped of legal representation, Galileo was interrogated in the dark, imposing halls of the Vatican. The inquisitors presented him with a document from 1616 claiming he had been forbidden from even discussing the Copernican theory. Galileo argued that his book merely examined the theories neutrally, but the tribunal was not interested in truth. They were interested in absolute submission. They threatened him with the terrifying instruments of torture, letting him know exactly what would happen to his aging bones if he did not recant. Broken by illness and the very real threat of being burned alive, Galileo surrendered. On June 22, 1633, dressed in the white shirt of a penitent sinner, Galileo knelt before the cardinals of the Inquisition. He read aloud a prepared confession swearing that he cursed and detested his past errors and heresies regarding the motion of the earth. He swore that the earth was stationary and that the sun revolved around it. Legend says that as the broken old man rose from his knees, he looked down at the ground, stamped his foot, and whispered a defiant phrase under his breath. And yet, it moves. Whether he spoke those famous words in that exact moment or not, the sentiment defined the rest of his life. The church could force his lips to lie, but they could not alter the fundamental laws of the universe. The truth remained untouched by their decrees. The Inquisition sentenced Galileo to life imprisonment, which the Pope commuted to permanent house arrest at his villa in Arcetri, high in the hills overlooking Florence. He was forbidden from publishing any books, receiving visitors without permission, or teaching his theories. It was a slow, isolating punishment meant to erase him from the intellectual world. But Galileo's spirit could not be caged. Even as total blindness claimed his eyes, the very eyes that had been the first in human history to see the rings of Saturn and the craters of the moon, he refused to stop working. In the quiet isolation of his home, dictating to his loyal disciples, Galileo wrote his final, crowning scientific achievement: the discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences. Unable to publish it in Catholic Italy, the manuscript was smuggled out of the country to Holland, a Protestant nation beyond the reach of the Inquisition. This book laid the foundational groundwork for modern physics, kinematics, and the strength of materials, directly inspiring the future work of Sir Isaac Newton. Galileo Galilei died on January 8, 1642, at the age of 77. The Church refused to allow him a proper public burial or a monument, fearing it would become a shrine to heresy. He was buried in a small, obscure room at the back of the Basilica of Santa Croce. But you cannot bury the truth. Within a few decades, the tide turned completely. The telescope could not be uninvented. The moons of Jupiter could not be unseen. Newton's laws of gravity soon mathematically locked the heliocentric universe into place, vindicating Galileo entirely. It took the Catholic Church more than 3 centuries to formally admit their mistake. In 1992, Pope John Paul II issued an official apology, expressing profound regret for the way Galileo was treated and acknowledging that the great scientist was right. Today, Galileo is remembered not as a defeated heretic, but as the father of modern observational astronomy, the father of modern physics, and the father of science itself. Galileo's true legacy is not just the discoveries he made, but the method he gave us to find them. He taught humanity to stop relying blindly on ancient texts, philosophical dogmas, and religious authorities to understand the physical world. He proved that truth is found through observation, experimentation, and rigorous mathematical reason. He looked beyond the horizon of human fear and stepped into the light of objective reality. He changed the universe, not by altering the stars, but by forever changing the way we look at them. If you enjoyed this journey through the discovery of the universe, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to continue discovering more fascinating figures in the history of humanity.